Number 10. The Vinci symbols. Thousands of years before many of the world's better-known writing systems appeared, strange markings were already being carved into artifacts across southeastern Europe. These signs, now known as the Vinci symbols, have been found on pottery, figurines, and other objects linked to the Vinci culture, a Neolithic society that flourished in the Balkans several thousand years before the rise of classical civilizations. At first glance, the symbols seem simple enough: lines, crosses, chevrons, and repeating geometric marks. But the deeper scholars look, the more unsettling the mystery becomes. The reason is not just their age, but what they might represent. Some researchers believe the Vinci symbols could be one of the earliest known attempts at symbolic communication, perhaps even a proto-writing system that appeared long before the scripts of Mesopotamia or Egypt became dominant. If that were true, it would push the roots of recorded meaning much further back than many people expect. Others argue the symbols were not true writing at all, but ritual marks, ownership signs, clan identifiers, or sacred motifs repeated across objects for social or religious reasons. That uncertainty is exactly what gives them their power. They sit on the edge of language without fully stepping into it. They look deliberate, they repeat. They appear in patterns that suggest intention rather than decoration. And yet no one has been able to prove that they record spoken language in the way a true script would. The Vinci symbols remain suspended in one of the most fascinating spaces in ancient history, between mark and message, between symbol and speech. What makes them so haunting is the possibility they represent. If they were a form of early writing, then they may preserve the faintest surviving trace of thoughts from a world so old that almost everything else about it has already dissolved into silence. And if they were not writing, they still reveal something profound, that even in the deep Neolithic past, human beings were already leaving behind signs powerful enough to make the future wonder what they were trying to say. Number 9. The Phaistos disc, discovered in 1908 in the ruins of the Minoan site of Phaistos on the island of Crete. The Phaistos disc is one of the strangest objects ever recovered from the ancient world. Made of fired clay and covered on both sides with spiraling sequences of stamped symbols, it looks less like an ordinary inscription and more like a message designed to resist time. Its signs include human figures, tools, plants, and abstract motifs, all pressed into the surface with a precision that has fascinated scholars for more than a century. Part of what makes the disc so extraordinary is how unique it is. Unlike many ancient scripts that appear across tablets, walls, seals, or monuments, the Phaistos disc stands almost alone. There is no large archive of matching texts to compare it against, no bilingual inscription to unlock it, and no secure body of related material that clearly explains what system it belongs to. That isolation has made serious decipherment almost impossible. Scholars can count symbols, study repetition, and analyze structure, but structure alone is not enough to recover meaning when the language behind it is still missing. Many theories have been proposed. Some believe it contains a hymn, a ritual text, a prayer, or a ceremonial record. Others think it may preserve a list, a code, or a form of communication tied to the still mysterious world of Bronze Age Crete. There have even been arguments over whether it is authentic at all, though most experts treat it as genuine. But whatever it is, the disc continues to resist every attempt to force it into a neat category. It looks organized, intentional, and meaningful, yet the key to reading it remains absent. That is what makes the Phaistos disc so unsettling. It feels like a message from the ancient world that survived almost perfectly, only to arrive in a future that cannot understand it. The symbols spiral inward as though drawing us toward an answer. But the closer we look, the further that answer seems to retreat. It is a reminder that sometimes the past does not vanish because its words were destroyed. Sometimes they survive intact and still remain unread. Number 8. Proto-Elamite script. Long before many of the ancient world's great empires reached their height, administrators in what is now Iran were already pressing strange signs into clay. This writing system, known as Proto-Elamite, appeared more than 5,000 years ago and is one of the oldest undeciphered scripts ever discovered. It survives mostly on clay tablets, many of them linked to accounting, labor, storage, and economic control, which means it likely recorded the practical machinery of an early civilization. But despite its age and importance, no one has ever fully unlocked what the signs actually say. That mystery becomes even more frustrating because Proto-Elamite does not look random. The tablets are structured, repeated, and clearly organized. Numerals and administrative patterns can often be identified, which tells us the system had order and purpose. We can see that it was being used seriously, probably by trained scribes operating inside a functioning bureaucracy. In other words, this was not decorative symbolism or scattered ritual marks. It was part of a living system of recorded information. The problem is that beyond the numerical and structural side, the language behind the script remains deeply unclear. Part of the difficulty is that Proto-Elamite seems to stand alone in too many ways. It has no helpful Rosetta Stone, no surviving bilingual key, and no clear later descendant that can be used to read it backwards with confidence. Scholars have made progress in identifying patterns, relationships, and possible sign functions, but progress is not the same as understanding. We can often tell that the tablets were meant to organize reality. We still cannot fully hear the people who organized it. That is what makes Proto-Elamite so haunting. It may contain records of trade, authority, labor, and daily life from one of the earliest urban worlds on Earth, yet those records remain trapped behind signs we cannot confidently interpret. A civilization tried to preserve itself in clay, and the clay survived. But the language did not come with it. What remains is one of the most frustrating silences in ancient history, a script old enough to stand near the beginning of writing itself, and still too distant for us to read. Number 7. The Indus script. Among the great civilizations of the ancient world, few are as impressive and as silent as the Indus Valley civilization. Its cities were carefully planned, its drainage systems were astonishingly advanced, and its trade networks reached across vast regions. Yet for all that sophistication, one of its greatest secrets is still locked away in tiny inscriptions found on seals, tablets, pottery, and other artifacts. These markings, now called the Indus script, remain one of the most famous undeciphered writing systems in history. At first glance, the inscriptions seem almost too short to carry so much mystery. Many contain only a handful of signs, often paired with animal imagery such as bulls, elephants, or the famous so-called unicorn motif. But those signs repeat in patterns, suggesting rules, structure, and deliberate order. They do not look like meaningless scratches. They look like part of a system people once understood instantly, a system tied to identity, administration, ritual, trade, or power. The problem is that no one today can say with certainty which of those functions was primary, or even whether the script encoded full spoken language in the way most writing systems do. That uncertainty has fueled enormous debate. Some researchers argue that the Indus script represents a true writing system used to record language. Others believe it may have functioned more like a set of symbols or elite markers, without fully encoding speech. The debate remains intense because the evidence is frustratingly limited. There are no long surviving texts, no bilingual inscriptions, and no confirmed descendant language that clearly preserves the script's meaning. The civilization left behind extraordinary cities, but not the clear textual bridge needed to interpret its signs. What makes the Indus script so powerful is that it stands at the center of a much larger silence. Here was one of the ancient world's great urban civilizations, and yet one of the most direct paths into its beliefs, institutions, and identity remains closed. We can excavate its streets, measure its walls, and admire its engineering, but the words of its people remain just beyond reach. The script survives in careful little clusters of signs, still visible after thousands of years. still waiting for a reader who has not yet arrived. Number 6. Rongorongo. On one of the most remote inhabited islands on Earth, a script survives that may represent one of the last unread voices of a vanished world. Known as Rongorongo, these carved symbols were found on wooden tablets from Rapa Nui or Easter Island, and they remain one of the greatest undeciphered writing mysteries in human history. At first glance, the signs look strikingly deliberate. Human figures, animals, geometric forms, and repeated symbols arranged in lines with a visual order that feels unmistakably intentional. What makes Rongorongo so extraordinary is not only its appearance, but the possibility of what it represents. If it is a true writing system, then it would be one of the very few independently developed scripts in human history. That alone would make it remarkable. But its story is darkened by timing and loss. By the time Europeans began paying serious attention to Easter Island's traditions, disease, enslavement, missionary destruction, and cultural collapse had already devastated the society that may once have known how to read these texts. The tablets remained, but the living chain of interpretation may already have been broken. That is why Rongorongo remains so difficult to decode. There is no confirmed bilingual key, no large archive of explanatory material, and no surviving native scholarly tradition that can tell us exactly how the signs were meant to function. Some researchers believe the tablets recorded genealogies, rituals, chants, or sacred knowledge. Others question whether the system fully encoded spoken language or operated in a more limited symbolic way. But even those disagreements only deepen the mystery. Because whatever Rongorongo was, it clearly belonged to a world of meaning that existed before the full force of outside disruption shattered it. That is what gives Rongorongo its haunting power. It is not just an unread script. It is a visible reminder of how close humanity can come to preserving a voice, only to lose the ability to hear it forever. The signs still sit there on the wood, carved by hands that expected understanding. And yet the civilization that once gave them meaning was transformed so violently that one of its most intimate intellectual traditions may now survive only as silent marks cut into fading tablets. Number 5. Linear. Before the better-known Greek world of the Mycenaeans left behind decipherable records, the island of Crete was already home to a script that still refuses to reveal its secrets. This script, known as Linear A, was used by the Minoans, one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. It appears on tablets, libation vessels, religious objects, and administrative records, suggesting that it was woven into both the practical and sacred life of a thriving society. Yet despite decades of study, the language behind it remains unread. Part of what makes Linear A so frustrating is how close it seems to being understood. Many of its signs resemble those of Linear B, the script later used by the Mycenaeans and successfully deciphered as an early form of Greek. Because of that visual similarity, scholars can often assign approximate sound values to some Linear A signs. But sound is not the same as meaning. Reading the symbols aloud phonetically does not unlock the language if the language itself is still unknown. It is like hearing echoes from a room whose door remains shut. That gap between form and understanding is what makes Linear A so compelling. It clearly belonged to a literate administrative culture. It appears in patterns that suggest accounting, offerings, record-keeping, and ritual use. We know it mattered. We know it was used by people running palaces, managing goods, and sustaining a complex society. But we do not know what those people were actually saying. The Minoans left behind frescoes, architecture, symbols, and traces of a vibrant world. But their written voice remains trapped behind a script we can only partially approach. And that is the deeper unease of Linear A. It reminds us that decipherment is not always a matter of time and patience alone. Sometimes a civilization disappears so completely that even when its signs survive, the language that once animated them vanishes from the earth. Linear A is the shadow of a speaking world that no longer exists, one of the clearest examples of how a civilization can leave writing behind and still remain, in one of the most important ways possible, unread. Number 4. The Voynich manuscript. Few ancient or medieval texts have achieved the same level of mystery as the Voynich manuscript. Filled with strange writing, impossible-looking plants, astronomical diagrams, naked figures in elaborate bathing scenes, and symbols that seem to belong to no known language, the manuscript has become one of the most famous unread books in the world. It looks like something that should have been understood long ago. Instead, it remains a puzzle that has resisted generations of scholars, linguists, and code breakers. What makes the Voynich manuscript so unsettling is how convincingly meaningful it appears. The script is consistent, the patterns repeat, the pages are organized into sections that seem to deal with different subjects, as if the book follows its own internal logic. Nothing about it feels careless. It does not look like random scribbling. It looks like a real system of knowledge, recorded by someone who expected it to be read and understood by the right audience. That is why the manuscript has inspired so many theories. Some believe it preserves an unknown natural science, a medical tradition, or a hidden body of botanical and astronomical knowledge. Others think it may be an encoded text, a constructed language, or a work connected to esoteric or ritual traditions. Skeptics have argued that it could be an elaborate hoax, but even that explanation struggles to account for the remarkable consistency and structure across the manuscript as a whole. If it is meaningless with extraordinary discipline. That is what gives the Voynich manuscript its enduring power. It is not just unreadable, it feels intentionally unreadable, as though it stands right at the boundary between knowledge and secrecy. Every page seems to promise that a complete world of meaning lies just beyond our reach. And perhaps that is why it remains so captivating. It is not simply a text we have failed to decode. It is a text that continues to make us wonder whether the ancient and medieval past preserved entire systems of thought that survived physically, but not intellectually, into the modern world. Number 3. The Etruscan mystery. Before Rome became the dominant power of the Italian peninsula, another civilization flourished there with wealth, artistry, religion, and influence strong enough to shape the world that came after it. These were the Etruscans, and although we know a great deal about their tombs, their art, and their interaction with early Rome, one of the most important parts of their civilization remains frustratingly incomplete: their language. The Etruscan language is not entirely unreadable in the way some lost scripts are. Its alphabet can be read and many inscriptions can be pronounced. The real mystery lies deeper than the letters themselves. We can sound out the words, but in many cases, we still do not fully understand what they mean. Because Etruscan does not fit neatly into the major language families surrounding it, and because surviving texts are often short or formulaic, the civilization's voice remains only partly accessible. It is there but dimmed, like a conversation heard through a wall. That partial silence is what makes the Etruscan case so haunting. This was not a forgotten fringe culture with no historical weight. The Etruscans helped shape the religious, political, and symbolic world inherited by Rome. Their influence stretched into architecture, ritual, and social life. Yet despite standing so close to one of history's most documented civilizations, their own language still resists complete recovery. It is one of the strangest situations in ancient history. A people important enough to shape the future, and yet still linguistically shadowed by the past. The mystery deepens because what survives is so uneven. Tomb inscriptions, names, and a limited number of longer texts provide valuable clues, but not enough to restore a full living language with confidence. We know enough to sense the outline of a lost voice, but not enough to hear it clearly. And that may be what makes the Etruscan mystery so powerful. It is not the silence of total erasure. It is the far more unsettling silence of partial survival, where a civilization speaks just enough to remind us how much of its meaning is still gone. Number 2. The Sumerian King List. Among the oldest written traditions in human history, few are as strange and unsettling as the Sumerian King List. At first glance, it appears to be a historical record, a sequence of rulers and dynasties stretching across ancient Mesopotamia, carefully preserving the succession of kingship from one city to another. But the deeper scholars look, the more the text begins to blur the line between history, memory, and myth. What makes the King List so extraordinary is the way it mixes the recognizable with the impossible. Some rulers and dynasties appear to belong to the world of real early Mesopotamian history, a world of city-states, political struggle, and royal power. But before those more familiar names, the list describes kings who supposedly ruled for impossibly long spans of time, sometimes tens of thousands of years. It also begins with a haunting claim that kingship descended from heaven. From that point on, the text moves through floods, shifting centers of power, and dynasties that seem suspended between divine order and human rule. That is why the Sumerian King List remains so difficult to classify. It is clearly meaningful. It was not random mythology written without purpose. It was a deliberate attempt to organize the past and define legitimacy, authority, and the continuity of civilization itself. But was it meant to be read as literal history, sacred political memory, symbolic tradition, or some combination of all three? That question still hangs over the text. It is readable in a basic sense, but not fully decodable in meaning, because the worldview that produced it is no longer fully recoverable. And that is what makes the King List so haunting. It is a text we can read, yet still cannot fully understand on its own terms. It preserves one of humanity's earliest visions of time, rulership, and order, but it does so in a language of meaning that does not fit comfortably inside modern categories. It is not merely a list of names, it is a reminder that even when ancient words survive, the deeper logic behind them can remain locked away, leaving us with a document that still feels like a message from a world operating by rules we no longer know how to interpret. Number 1, the possibility of lost ancient languages. The most unsettling mystery on this list may not be any single script, manuscript, or inscription. It may be the possibility that what we have found is only a tiny surviving fraction of what once existed. For every text carved in stone, pressed into clay, or painted onto a page, how many others vanished completely? How many languages were spoken, written, and understood for centuries, only to disappear so fully that not a single person alive today even knows their names? That possibility changes everything. The Vinci symbols, the Phaistos disc, Proto-Elamite, the Indus script, Rongorongo, Linear A, the Voynich manuscript, the Etruscan language, and the Sumerian King List all survive as fragments of worlds we can only partly reach. Some are undeciphered, some are partially understood. Some can be read aloud without truly being understood in depth. But together they point toward a far greater silence, the silence of entire systems of thought that may have vanished without leaving enough behind to ever be reconstructed. Because when a language dies, more dies with it than vocabulary. A way of organizing reality disappears. Metaphors disappear. Sacred meanings disappear. Political concepts, family structures, cosmologies, songs, humor, memory, and identity all begin to collapse into absence. If no translation survives and no descendant tradition remains, then a civilization can leave monuments, cities, and symbols behind, while still losing one of the most intimate parts of itself forever. That may be the real meaning behind all of these unread texts. They do not just show us that some messages remain unsolved. They suggest that the ancient world was once far more intellectually crowded than the modern world can now detect. Entire archives may be gone. Entire literate traditions may be erased. Entire languages may have risen and disappeared without leaving enough evidence for us to even recognize that they were ever there. And that is why this takes the number 1 place. The greatest mystery may not be the texts we cannot decode, but the voices we no longer know we lost. Because if even the surviving fragments are this difficult to understand, then somewhere beyond them lies an even darker possibility, that much of the ancient world is not silent because it had nothing to say, but because the keys to hearing it have already vanished with the people who once spoke.